up? I got Naskin here with me. This ain't a diss song, but yeah, you know what it is. I'm a cheesehead, y'all niggas cheese whiz. Pittsburgh Steelers, that's nothing. That Super Bowl ring, that's nothing. Pull up in your town when you
Hi, everyone. Welcome to Packers Unscripted from Packers.com. I am Mike Spofford. He is my trusted colleague, Wes Hodkiewicz. We're coming to you here from our studios at Lambeau Field. And Wes, now that week one is out of the way and a Thursday night opener and a different schedule and all that, okay, we're into week two. We need to start getting into our routine, which means our midweek show on a Wednesday is the official look at the upcoming opponent. And in this case, that's the Minnesota Vikings coming to Lambeau Field Sunday afternoon for the Packers home opener. And when you take a look at this Vikings team, I know we talked a couple of days ago about their week one victory over the Falcons, but I know last year when we were previewing the Vikings, it was all about Kirk Cousins, the new quarterback, the big contract and all that. But when you look at this Vikings offense, at least what we've seen through one game, it doesn't start with Kirk Cousins. It starts with Dalvin Cook.
Yeah, and it's weird because it was funny. I was working on the game program for this week, and there's a part of it called In the League Rankings where it's matching up how the Packers are faring against their opponent. This is the first time in all my years doing this where Kirk Cousins didn't throw enough passes to qualify for the rankings. So there's actually just an NQ next to the passer section for the Vikings with their offense.
Yeah, 10 pass attempts doesn't get you onto the leaderboard.
8 of 10 for 98 yards, 97 total passing yards if you count in the -1 yard sack. Not what you were expecting. But at the same time, you know, you look at the way that this offense was structured in the opponent that they were facing. I think, you know, Mike Zimmer and the Vikings, they felt like there was a big opportunity there to run the football. Dalvin Cook is now a year removed from that ACL.
Yep.
Came back strong last season, and, you know, they hitched their wagon to him again. Regardless of who the quarterback has been over the last 20, 25 years for the Vikings, the most effective teams have had a solid running back in that backfield, and I think there's a lot of, you know, hope that for Minnesota for years to come, that guy's Dalvin Cook.
Well, it's interesting to me because it's almost as though Mike Zimmer, who's a defensive-minded head coach, obviously, he's had his conflicts over the years with his offensive coordinators as far as philosophy and play calling and all of that. It's almost as though Mike Zimmer maybe finally has the offense that he wants to run. He wants to pound the ball on the ground. He wants to play defense. He doesn't want to get into shootouts with teams, that kind of thing. Now, can you do that for an entire 16 games? You know, I don't know. We'll see how that goes. But the other part of it is obviously any head coach would love to get out to a 21-0 lead with 5 minutes left in the second quarter.
Right.
And from that point on, the rest of the game, Kirk Cousins only threw 3 passes. He had 7 pass attempts through the first quarter and a half, and then they just didn't throw the ball at all after that. So the game against the Falcons, the flow of the game dictated some of the way the statistics went and how it all got skewed. But I do think Mike Zimmer, with Dalvin Cook as his number one, and with the rookie from Boise State, Madison, I forget his... Alexander. I was trying to remember his first name. Alexander Madison, third-round draft pick, I believe, from Boise State. Those two guys, as a very young, dynamic 1-2 punch in the backfield, this is how Mike Zimmer wants to play offense.
Well, I'm glad you brought that up because Dalvin Cook had 21 carries for 111 yards. His longest was only 22, so that shows he was just really steady production. He wasn't getting halted. But when Madison came in to spell him, 9 for 49, an average 4.3 yards per clip. That's a solid average, and you can see why, if you're getting that kind of ground production and consistent ground production, you don't want to put the ball back in the air. If they're going to give you 5-6 yards a run,
why would
you're going to take that.
Right.
Now, the other side of it is there has to be give and take. They aren't going to throw the ball 160 times this year with Kirk Cousins. There are going to be games where they're going to need to rely on that. So that, to me, is still the biggest question mark right now for this Vikings offense is that, Cousins statistically was fine last season, but I think there was a lot of people, when you talked about the play calling earlier in the season last year, there's a lot of folks that just thought he was going to go into Minnesota with all the hype, all the 4,000, 500, 600-yard passing years in Washington and just light the night sky on fire. And it didn't work out that way, for a number of different factors. But if they have I think everybody understands Kirk Cousins is a starting quarterback in this league. Is he an elite one? That's a different debate. But if you can pair a running game with him, that's going to, be what gives the Vikings their biggest chance here in the long run.
Yeah, well, and we've seen in the past, whether it's been Kirk Cousins or Sam Bradford or other quarterbacks for the Vikings, this pair of wide receivers, Stefon Diggs and Adam Thielen, I don't know, you can rank them however you want, 1-2, 2-1, but those two guys, and I take nothing away from the Packers and Davante Adams as a number one, but, not necessarily a fully proven Pro Bowl caliber number two. The Vikings have this pair that I think is clearly the top 1-2 in the NFC North in terms of that position, and we've seen each of these guys have big games against Green Bay in the past. The Packers could. You can't. My point is, you can't just completely sell out to stop Dalvin Cook because Thielen and Diggs and tight end Kyle Rudolph with an experienced quarterback like Cousins, they'll find another way to move the football.
I did a interview with the wonderful people over at Vikings.com this week, and I said my biggest key to victory in this game, and we'll talk about the defense and everything for the Packers here shortly, in terms of the Vikings defense versus Davante Adams. But my biggest thing is going to be Adam Thielen versus what Mike Pettin wants to do to defend him, and then Mike Zimmer and how he wants to defend Davante Adams. Which cornerback's going to see him? How much shade are you going to be throwing his way with the coverage over the top? To me, you ask 1A, 1B, Stefon Diggs is a fine receiver. He's a good receiver, and he fits this offense well. Adam Thielen is on the border of elite now. With the season he had a year ago, 113 catches, 1,372 yards, 9 touchdowns. Michael, the guy has over 200 catches the last 2 years combined. He's been durable. When you talk about undrafted success stories and, in guys coming from small schools, kind of coming out of nowhere, Adam Thielen is that guy.
Yeah, Minnesota Mankato, right?
And it's sort of one of those things where you almost wonder if he was in a state school, would the Vikings have even taken a look? Where would this guy have ended up? The cream ultimately rises to the top in this league, but the Vikings gave him that opportunity. They allowed him to grow for 2 seasons, and he's really blossomed into a special receiver. And I think the ultimate credit to both him and Diggs is they've been able to have success regardless of who the quarterback has been.
Right.
Regardless of if it was Case Keenum, Sam Bradford, Kirk Cousins, Teddy Bridgewater, they've found ways to be effective, and it's definitely going to be something the Packers are going to have to take a big look at with how they want to defend those two guys.
Yeah, well, as much as the Vikings have put together, obviously, their skill positions, their perimeter guys, and Stefon Diggs being a 5th-round draft pick wasn't exactly highly thought of coming out of college either, but the Vikings have put it together there. The question with this offense is always the offensive line. They've had changes in personnel over the years. They've had some good years. They've had some bad years. They've dealt with injuries just like every team does. You look at how things went last week. Obviously, they ran the ball really, really well. Credit to their offensive line for that. But even in just the 10 pass attempts that Kirk Cousins had, he was sacked once. I believe PFF had like 5 pressures from Atlanta's defensive front on just the 10 pass attempts. So probably what Zimmer is going to be trying to figure out along with his offensive coaches is, okay, can we run the ball the way we want to and have that type of offensive line, but can we also protect our quarterback when we need to throw the ball? They weren't challenged in that way because they didn't need to throw it against Atlanta. We'll find out here on Sunday at Lambeau if that changes.
Nobody will ever talk about what their weaknesses are. Teams just don't use that kind of language.
Yeah.
But you can always tell where the emphasis is based on how teams draft. In the Vikings, there has been a heavy emphasis on the offensive line over the last few years. Certainly Riley Reif was a big signing from them coming over from Detroit.
Right.
But you look at it, Mike, Garrett Bradbury this past year was a 1st-round pick. Pat Elflein was a 3rd-rounder 2 years ago. Brian O'Neill, their starting right tackle, was a 2nd-rounder last year. Drew Samia they drafted this year in the 4th round. They took 3 offensive linemen in this draft, and they want to be able to give Kirk Cousins, give Dalvin Cook the type of line that's going to allow them to make plays. Now, it's going to be a work in progress. It's a very young line for the most part. This isn't that veteran group that you saw from 5-6 years ago. So seeing how they weather this season, especially early on here, if they do give up some pressures, is going to be something to watch. But certainly from the Packers' perspective, after the performance that they had last week with all the sacks, all the pressures, all the quarterback hits on Mitchell Trubisky, the Smiths, Kenny Clark, they want to be able to keep that momentum in this game now against Minnesota.
Yeah, all right. Well, before we get to the Vikings defense, we'll take care of a little sponsor business here. Select Cousin Subs locations are now offering delivery. Whether you're ordering catering or your favorite sub, they're delivering right to you when you order online at cousinsubs.com. Cousin Subs, we believe in better. Okay, Minnesota's defense, Wes. We've talked over the years on this show about Xavier Rhodes and Harrison Smith in that secondary. I think, two guys who at cornerback and safety respectively are two of the elite players in this entire league. Suddenly now Anthony Harris, 2 interceptions of Matt Ryan. He's the reigning NFC Defensive Player of the Week. That's a pretty nice addition to some really established Pro Bowl caliber players.
Rick Spielman, offensively, they've gone through a lot in the last few years, trying to find the right quarterback, trying to find their running back. Obviously, as we just talked about, the offensive line. To me, though, I don't know if there's a better blueprint right now in the NFL. Maybe it's what Chicago's done, but for the most part, a better blueprint than what Minnesota has done with their defense over the last 5-6 years. You look at their starters, Mike, you see a lot of numbers. You don't see a lot of FAs. I mean, they found guys, they develop guys, and they become playmakers. And then you get Anthony Harris, who was a college free agent 4 years ago, and now he's making big plays next to Harrison Smith.
Right.
That's what you want to do. That's how you want to draw it up. And again, it's not an easy out. I was, again, that same interview I was doing with the Vikings people, last week was tough for the Packers, trying to get the offense going, trying to get the ground game moving, getting some of the downfield pass stuff going. This week doesn't get any easier.
No, it doesn't.
The Vikings are veteran. You have a group that has worked together and played together for so long. I mean, look at Anthony Barr, Mike. I mean, there was reports that he was out of town and then he wanted to come back. You don't see that kind of stuff every year because of the culture, the chemistry, and the success that defense has built.
And he goes and buries Matt Ryan early in the game, gets a big sack, and kind of the big welcome back. We're glad you're still here kind of thing from the Vikings fans.
And you got the maestro in Mike Zimmer still coordinating this whole thing, still calling the plays defensively. One of the most difficult jobs I think in all of the NFL. And the Vikings are still who everyone thinks they are.
Yeah, the interesting thing to me, because I was asked this in our insider inbox, and I'll give you what my take on it was, and you can either agree or disagree. But one of the readers asked me, okay, so what's the difference between the Bears defense and the Vikings defense? Everybody said, everybody knows both units are good, this and that. The way I characterize it is I feel like the Bears are a defense that plays everything much more straight up.
Sure. Yeah.
They don't blitz a lot. They rely on their front four to get pressure. But with the Vikings, and I'm not saying this is like a knock on them because they get the results they're looking for. But the Vikings, to me, they always strike me as a much more exotic unit. They're going to give you crazy fronts and different looks. And when you're talking about those guys up front, Everson Griffin and Danielle Hunter and Anthony Barr and all those guys in the front seven, they just do a lot more of the different stuff with all those guys, whereas the Bears, play it kind of straight. The other thing that I would say is a difference when you look at last year in particular, the Vikings only had, I believe it was about 20 takeaways last year, which was a low number for them.
Yeah.
And defensively, that was part of the reason they weren't able to get back to the playoffs and repeat their success from 2017, whereas the Bears defense obviously was tops in the league in takeaways a year ago. But don't sleep on this Vikings defense when it comes to turnovers, because they've certainly done that in the past, and they have the veteran players who have the track record over a long period of time of doing that.
Yeah, it's organized chaos is the way I've always described Mike Zimmer's scheme, and that goes back to his time with Cincinnati. The Packers saw him plenty back then as well, and then certainly he became a fixture in this division, due in part to the fact that if you're the Vikings, if you're the Lions, if you're the Bears, you need to have a good, solid defense and a good scheme when you're facing Aaron Rodgers twice a year and you're competing with him and his teams to win a division title. What I really like, though, that I think we've seen in the last few years with Minnesota, with them being able to cultivate their talent, when they had a hole, they went and signed Linville Joseph. That worked out great for them at nose tackle the last 4 years now. But what I really like is now you have a bunch of players that are immersed in Mike Zimmer's scheme, much like where the Cincinnati Bengals were at before he got the head coaching job with the Vikings. They got guys that believe in it, they understand it. And yeah, I think you laid that out perfectly to the commoner that is asking that question. We'll see in the long run what they want to do with Chuck Pagano and what his influence is going to be on that defense.
Yeah, in Chicago.
But Vic Fangio's whole thing was to get pressure with your front, not have to sell out and keep guys back. The thing that you're going to see with the Vikings that we see every single time is that pressure is going to come from everywhere. It's going to come from the safeties. It's going to come from the inside linebackers, all built out of a 4-3 front. It's something that has given every quarterback in this league fits, and certainly been a challenge here for the Packers with this first or the second game now for Matt LaFleur in this offense.
Yeah, well, certainly in looking at the turnover department, the Atlanta Falcons, as I mentioned a couple of days ago, they had chances to get back into that game in the second half. They were putting drives together and moving the ball, and then Matt Ryan made a couple of really poor decisions that resulted in interceptions, and then they couldn't get back in the game to give themselves a shot there. So the turnover thing is definitely something with this Vikings defense. They've always seemed to be more of a turnover type defense when they play at home versus on the road for whatever reason. But that being said, the way Aaron Rodgers protected the football, got sacked a handful of times against the Bears, but for the most part he protected the football. I think it only came out maybe the one time on the scramble.
Yeah, the forced fumble from Ha.
From Ha.
Yeah.
But aside from that, the Packers really did protect the football well against the Bears, and that needs to continue. One other thing I need to ask you about, though, get me up to date on where the kicking situation is with the Minnesota Vikings, both kicker and punter, because the news over the last couple days now in the NFL is the guy that the Vikings traded a 5th-round pick for in training camp and then they cut. Yeah. He ended up getting cut now by the New York Jets.
Correct.
And now the Jets have signed Sam Ficken, who was in Green Bay in training camp and trying to win the job from Mason Crosby. He's now the kicker for the New York Jets, and the Vikings stuck with Dan Bailey, correct?
That's correct. You got that all right.
All right. I'm keeping up.
Anyone that ever bothers me, I shouldn't say bothers, that has such a negative connotation. Anybody that ever asks me about making a change at kicker in the middle of training camp and was Mason Crosby in jeopardy, I just want to roll that 15-second clip there of you trying to explain what happened with the Vikings, with the Jets, and everybody else in between when you make a change that late in the process. I'll say this about the Vikings. They traded the 5th-round pick for, I think it's Kerry Vedvik. He was a really sought-after, highly regarded kicker/punter from the Baltimore Ravens, but if you know anything about Baltimore, they probably have the best special teams in the league, so there wasn't a place for him. He gets traded to Minnesota. It doesn't work out. Dan Bailey hit 75% of his kicks last year. They decided to stick with him this year. I think they made the right decision sticking with him now. But the domino effect of all that was that now Sam Ficken ends up in New York because Vedvik ended up there and it didn't work out. Oh, and then by the way, Britton Colquitt now is the punter for the Minnesota Vikings.
They made a change at punter right at the end of the preseason, right?
Yeah, so the guy that they had, I think it was Matt Wiley, they cut him when Colquitt became available. And now Britton Colquitt's their punter. So some changes there, some shifting tides. I'll say this, and I remember talking with Mason Crosby about this several years ago when Tim Mastey was playing the way he was and Brett Good was in the middle of his career. When you have stable special teams, that goes so far in terms of the specialist position. That goes so far in solidifying your entire unit. I feel like the Vikings are trying to get there, but they're still trying to find ways to improve. How that is going to end up shuffling out is going to be really interesting to watch because I think if you go back over these last 4 years now for Minnesota, it's been their defense, it's been their offense, and then it's been special teams way down below in terms of what phases have been in like the pecking order.
Yeah.
They want to get more consistency there. I think Mike Zimmer's trying to display more patience with it.
Did they get a new coordinator on special teams?
I believe so. And then
I can't
weren't
remember.
They also
off the top
hiring
of my
like
head.
a kicking specialist too? Or
yeah,
something?
I think they were working on that as well.
So,
yeah.
Be that as it may, this is where things stand right now. Dan Bailey will be the kicker. Certainly, the Packers have seen a lot of him over the years. And Britton Colquitt as the punter.
Well, and when you mentioned special teams in general, the Vikings did start that game against the Falcons with a blocked punt. Did they not? Which got them off to a great start in that phase. So as you say, if they're trying to bring their special teams back up to another level, regardless of who's doing the kicking and the punting, when you get a blocked punt in week one, that puts everybody on notice that is playing you. That's like, hey, all right, we gotta see what they're doing scheme wise here. We got to figure this out, because those are those types of plays on special teams are just as good as turnovers.
Absolutely, yeah. And the other thing to keep an eye on too. So many years when the Packers would play the Vikings, you're always concerned about the returner. Not saying that you aren't now, but Amir Abdullah has actually resurfaced now as their kickoff and punt returner.
That's right. Yeah. He's their number 3 running back.
Yeah, former Detroit Lions running back is now their returner after so many years of the Packers. Obviously having some big battles there as well in that phase of the game with Minnesota.
All right, well, with that, we will call it a wrap on this edition of Packers Unscripted. Be sure to follow all of our coverage of the team on Packers.com. You can subscribe to us, like us on iTunes and other podcast services if you'd prefer not to look at our faces. On Twitter, he's at WesHod. I'm at Mike Spofford at Packers for the team account. Thanks for tuning in, everybody. We'll see you next time.
I just love my team. Yeah, that's the team with them big G's on the helmet.